Hello, Hashim here with Flat Fee Landlord Houston. We service landlords and property investors in all of the greater Houston area. We manage single family homes, townhomes, and condominiums. And today I want to go over the number one concern, number one question, number one reason people call our office is how to handle an eviction here in Houston. And, whether you're watching this because you're in a situation where you unfortunately have to evict your tenant, or you want to rent out your property and you're concerned with, hey, what happens if my tenant stops paying rent, or I got to him out for some reason, how do I evict them? And so maybe you're watching it for that reason. So I'm going to go over the steps. Number one, I'm going to bust a myth here. No matter what your neighbors or your friends may have told you that also rent out properties, the eviction process isn't really that complicated if you know what you're doing, that is. The number one thing, us as humans, we're worried about things that we don't know. So if you're unfamiliar with the process, I can understand why it may be daunting. But I can tell you right now, if you know what you're doing, which we do, and if you have the experience and know-how, then you'll find out once I go through these steps with you, it's really not that complicated, especially if you have done things the right way leading up to this process. So what I mean by that is, number one thing, first and foremost, have a written and legal lease in place, okay? So these are for those people that are watching that have not had a tenant in place yet. If you're thinking about renting out your property, it's almost common sense, but I can't stress it enough. Make sure you have a legal and written lease in place with your tenant before you rent out your property, because that's really going to help with the eviction process, and it'll really complicate things if you don't have one. So number one. So let's get into it. So when is rent due in Houston? Obviously first of the month, okay? But when is it considered late? The third day of the month. All right, so if your tenant has not paid by the third day of the month, it is now considered late, and you can go through with starting the eviction process. Now, I'm going to tell you what I would do as a landlord and what the law says, okay? So as a landlord, what I would recommend for you before you just jump right into eviction mode, if you've done a good job with pre-screening these tenants and you have a good relationship with them, which hopefully you do, rather than just going straight into eviction mode on the fourth day of the month, I would recommend you reach out to your tenants and see what the holdup is in terms of getting your rent, okay? Because a lot of times, our residents are people too, and a lot of times something really could have gone wrong. Maybe they do direct deposit with you through an online service, and they tried to hit submit and they forgot and it just didn't go through, or maybe they thought they had an automatic payment set up and it turns out they didn't, or maybe they submitted or mailed in the rent check and it just didn't get to you. And just reaching out to them, calling them, shooting them a quick email saying, hey, it's the 4th of the month, haven't got rent yet, could you just give me an update? A lot of times that solves a lot of problems, and your tenant will jump on it to make sure you get your rent payment and also make sure it doesn't happen again. So that's the number one thing I recommend you do before you jump into the eviction process. But let's say you exhausted all that, and now you've gotten to the point where you tried that, you can't get a hold of them, they're not going to pay, you got to get them out. All right, so number one, speed is key. Don't wait forever to try to do this, or don't fall for any false promises, because the more you do, the more of a hole you're going to fall into as a landlord. So don't fall for the installment plan or anything like that. If your gut tells you that you're not going to get paid, then jump into eviction mode at that point. So first thing you want to do is send out a notice to pay or vacate. All right, that's called a 3-day notice to pay or vacate. So after the third day, on the fourth day, you want to send that out. Now, you want to exhaust all the ways that this tenant gets it, because you want to make sure they receive it and it shows that you mean business, okay? So the number one way you definitely want to make sure you send it is through certified mail. All right, that's what the court's going to look at if it gets to that point. All right, number two, you also want to email it if you have your tenant's email, which hopefully you do on their application. And number three, you also want to mail it regular mail or hand deliver it if you're going to do that as well. So you can do all those things, but the number one way you definitely want to make sure you do it is through certified mail or a courier, because that shows that you have actual receipt that it was delivered, and you can bring that documentation with you to court once you get to that level. All right, so your tenant receives it. They now have 3 days to make sure they pay that rent. If they don't, then you go and file what's called an unlawful detainer with the courthouse, and that's when you set up a court date for you and your tenant to show up at the county courthouse and basically state your case of why you think the tenant owes you money and why the tenant may or may not dispute owing that amount of money. At that court date, the judge is going to hear you out. If you have your documentation, this is when you want to make sure you prepare it and bring it with you, because especially your lease, the judge is definitely going to want to make sure you have the lease, because that's really what he's going to look at, he or she is going to look at in regards to making a judgment on whether the tenant should be evicted or should pay a prorated portion or not be evicted at all and not rule in your favor. So definitely make sure you have your lease, make sure you have whatever other documentation you think may support your case, bring it with you at that court date, and give it to the judge so he or she can make that decision. All right, so let's assume the judge goes ahead and rules in your favor and sees, yes, the tenant does owe you money and they need to pay it or get out. Then the judge will issue what's called a writ of possession so that you can regain control of that property. Now, you have to wait, even though you have received that as a landlord, that doesn't mean you automatically now have received possession of the property, okay? Basically, after you have received the writ of possession judgment, then the tenant has 5 days to appeal that judgment. If the judgment is appealed by the tenant, that goes through a whole nother set of things that can really delay the eviction process, which would set another court date. Let's assume they don't appeal. Then after that 5 days, you're going to want to coordinate with the constable and meet the constable at the property with the writ of possession. And also at that time, you want to make sure you coordinate with the locksmith to meet you at the property with the constable so that you can change the locks, okay? At that time, when you meet the constable, the locksmith, you change the locks, you have now gotten the constable to give you possession of the property. Congratulations, you have now effectively regained possession of your property. You change the lock so that the tenant can't go into the property again after you and the constable leave. So you have now received the property free and clear, and you can go back to re-renting it or do whatever it is that you need to do. So again, it's really not that complicated. However, I do want to let you know that you do have to make sure you hit all these things in order and the correct way. Otherwise, any mistake along the way could cause even further delay. The entire process from start to finish, if there is no appeals, should give you a good an expectation of how long it takes, is probably going to be anywhere from about 30 to 45 days to effectively get a tenant out. And it could even take up to really 60 days, depending on some of the nuances, how backed up the courthouse may be, how backed up the constable may be, or, like I said, if the tenant decides to file an appeal as well. So if you got any questions, if you're in a situation right now, you have a question, or if you have more questions regarding evicting tenants in Houston, or anything in regards to property management, renting out your property, anything like that, feel free to go to our website. We're at HoustonPropertyManager.com, or you can also give us a call at our office.